I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network, and this is a breaking news alert. Oh, and this is a good one. So the January 6th committee just filed a motion with a federal judge out in Orange County, still within the Central District of California. You probably know him, Judge David Carter. Judge David Carter was the federal court judge who found that the attorney-client privilege assertions of John Eastman to Donald Trump could not be established because of the crime fraud exception. Judge David Carter was the federal judge who had found that Donald Trump and John Eastman were engaged in a coup in search of a legal theory and found it was more likely than not they engaged in criminal conspiracy conduct to overthrow the Democratic elections of 2020. Well, these proceedings before Judge Carter are still going on. They're still taking place. And the January 6th committee just filed a motion saying there's about 500 and plus documents that John Eastman still needs to turn over. And the January 6th committee is asking Judge David Carter to look at these documents, which John Eastman, who purports to be Donald Trump's lawyer, is still claiming are privileged records because the January 6th committee believes that the assertions are privileged, are invalid, like John Eastman's previous assertions of privilege. And what the January 6th committee states in their motion to Judge Carter is, as we threaten to file this motion, John Eastman started turning over some additional records because he was afraid that Your Honor was going to catch or expose him. And what we found in some of the records he turned over were that his privilege claims were completely unfounded. Now, some of these documents that John Eastman turned over out of fear that the January 6th committee was going to expose him to the judge are just a doozy. And so in these one email exchange that was turned over, you have John Eastman, Trump lawyer, speaking to other Trump lawyers, basically both kind of mocking Trump and admitting to crimes and violations of the Emoluments Clause of the Constitution. So let me read from you this paragraph in the January 6th committee's motion. It says, other documents produced to the Select Committee on the eve of this court's review after months of meritless privilege assertions further underscore the unreliable nature of Dr. Eastman's privilege descriptions. For example, Dr. Eastman previously described Chapman 059766, attached as Exhibit C, and Chapman 059767, attached as Exhibit D, as, quote, communications with counsel, Ray, reply in support of cert petitions. In other words, they're saying that these numbers, which have these Bates numbers, those numbers 59766 are the amount of the number of documents they are in the series of documents, and the Chapman is just the prefix. The Bates is the number. So this was Chapman document 59,766, and it was labeled as a privileged document. But when the documents were finally produced, they actually consist of email exchanges regarding travel plans and stays at Trump International. See Exhibit D. And this is what the email says from Trump's lawyers, John Eastman. A shame you are not in D.C. and could contribute to a violation of the Emoluments Clause. And I'm staying at the Trump International in D.C. from January 3rd to at least the 8th, doing my part to curry favor with the president by lining his empty pockets. Emoji. And so here are documents of Trump's lawyers bragging about violations of the Emolument Clause leading up to January 6th and doing their part to curry favor with Trump by lining his empty pockets and then also mocking his purported wealth. The January 6th committee in their motion goes on to say, as these examples illustrate, Dr. Eastman's representations regarding the nature or content of the remaining 562 documents are unreliable. Congressional defendants Therefore, ask that the court review these documents in camera to determine the validity of Dr. Eastman's privilege assertions and the applicability of the limitations and exceptions considered in this court's prior orders. Limitations and exceptions, pretty much they're a code for the crime fraud exception, and limitations, meaning some of the conduct was done outside of the scope of legal advice, and including waiver, compelling need, and the crime fraud exception. The document goes on to say one of the other things that the motion says is another example of a document that John Eastman was withholding. It was a photo of one of Trump's rallies with a handwritten note that Trump wrote saying, "Times 50 such events, no way this loses." And again, here the January 6th committee is saying he was asserting this as a privileged document. There's clearly nothing privileged about it. And so they're asking Judge Carter to make a ruling deeming these records not privileged, turning them over to the January 6th committee, the 562 other records that the January 6th committee hasn't seen yet. You may also be asking, why are they calling themselves the congressional defendants? Well, that's because when the January 6th committee sought these records from John Eastman filed a lawsuit, him being the plaintiff, against the January 6th committee to not turn over these records. The case was assigned to federal Judge Carter, who's a no-nonsense judge, and I've actually appeared multiple times, many times in front of Judge Carter as a practicing lawyer. Judge Carter, just by way of background, is a Vietnam vet, a hero in the Vietnam War, no-nonsense judge appointed by President Clinton, very much a law and order judge. Starts his courtroom very, very early, sometimes to get work done earlier than mostly all federal judges. It wouldn't be out of place for Judge Carter to start court at 7 a.m. or sometimes earlier. And he's someone who really, really cares about our Constitution in its truest sense, not in a performative sense. And so when ultimately John Eastman filed his lawsuit against the January 6th committee not to turn over the records, and the case got assigned to Judge Carter, that was a very good sign that law and order was going to be followed here. And Judge Carter's prior discovery ruling, where he ruled that Donald Trump and John Eastman were not really having legal discussions. They were engaged in plotting a coup in search of a legal theory and making an actual finding that it was more likely than not they engaged in criminal conduct. Thus, the crime fraud exception applies, vitiating any claim of attorney-client privilege, right? Attorney-client privilege means that there is a confidential communication between attorney and client in furtherance of the litigation, but to the extent they're engaged in a criminal enterprise, that defeats any claim of the attorney-client privilege. It's one of the exceptions, and so that's where Judge Carter found previously there was an exception to the attorney-client privilege, and these records were turned over to the January 6th committee, which they used in their hearings. And clearly before the next hearing, which is scheduled now to take place within the next 10 days or so, January 6th committee wants these emails. My prediction, they will get these emails, these extra 562 emails and records. But again, buried in this, though, was the fact that the January 6th committee got these records that say, again, a shame you are not in D.C. and could contribute to a violation of the Emoluments Clause. I'm staying at the Trump International D.C. from January 3rd to at least the 8th, doing my part to curry favor with the president by lining his empty pockets with an emoji. That's how people are saying behind Trump's back. This is how despicable they are. Thankfully, the January 6th committee is fighting for our democracy. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit the subscribe button right now. We're on our way to 1 million subscribers, thanks to you. If you're not subscribing already, hit subscribe. It's free. hit subscribe. It's free. Also, if you want to support the MeidasTouch Network, one of the things that you can do as well is go to patreon.com/MeidasTouch. That's patreon.com/MeidasTouch. We're not funded by any outside investors at all. We're fueled by democracy and powered by you. I always get asked these questions by people who watch these videos. What can I do to help grow the MeidasTouch Network? No matter where you are, what country you're in, if you want to help grow this network, you can join our Patreon at patreon.com/MeidasTouch. There's different membership tiers with exclusive benefits there. Go check it out. For now, I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Until next time.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs. It wasn't rigged, you're just a loser. At store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.